Okay, so here's a huge question that's always at the center of conversations about immigration and integration. When people pack up their lives and move to a new country, what happens to their deepest held values? Do they change? Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating study that looks at exactly that, how social values shift or sometimes don't from one generation to the next. Right, so this is really the core question we're tackling today. And look, we're not just talking about the surface level stuff like food or language. We're getting into the really deep seated beliefs, things like family, gender roles, personal freedom. This stuff is at the very heart of the whole integration debate. So let's see what the data has to say.
All right, before we go any further, let's make sure we're all on the same page with the terminology. The study basically measures values on a spectrum. So on one end, you've got what they call social conservatism. Think traditional gender roles and more reserved attitudes towards things like homosexuality, abortion, and divorce. On the other end of the spectrum is social liberalism, which is all about gender equality and having more tolerant or even positive views on those same issues. This spectrum is going to be super important for understanding everything that follows.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of the study's findings, we need to talk about the big theory that underpins all of this. It's something social scientists have been talking about for a long time, and it's called the integration hypothesis. The logic here is actually pretty simple when you break it down. Step one, as societies get more developed, wealthier, more educated, they tend to become more socially liberal. It's just a general trend we see. Step two, immigrants coming from less developed places are often, on average, more socially conservative. So you put those two things together, and what's the prediction? Well, that's step three. Over generations, their values should start to liberalize and look more like those of their new country. The big expectation is that the kids of immigrants, the second generation, will be way more liberal than their parents were. That's the theory in a nutshell. So, that's the theory. But the real question is, does it actually hold up in the real world? When you look at the hard data, what do you find? Let's put it to the test. And the answer? A pretty resounding yes. The study basically confirms the hypothesis. When you zoom out and look at the big picture, the kids of immigrants are consistently and measurably more socially liberal than their parents' generation. This isn't just a hunch, it's a real shift you can see in the numbers, across a whole bunch of different groups. Let's make this a little more concrete. Take a look at attitudes toward gender roles. This chart right here shows a pattern that pops up again and again in the research. See that first bar? That's the first generation. They start out the most conservative. But then, look at the second generation. They make a huge leap towards the more liberal average of rooted Europeans. They don't close the gap completely, but they get a lot closer. It's like a textbook example of the integration hypothesis playing out right in front of us. Okay, now let's zoom in a bit, because the details here are really, really interesting. So this table is all about whether people agree that men have more right to a job if jobs are hard to come by. The numbers you see are the value gap compared to native-born Europeans on a 10-point scale. Now, look at the Christian immigrants from developing countries. The first generation has this tiny little gap of plus 0.5, but by the second generation, it's zero. Gone. Their views are basically identical to rooted Europeans. I mean, that's a perfect example of full integration on an issue. But now look at the non-Western Muslim immigrants. You see a clear shift. The gap shrinks from plus 2.3 down to 1.0. So they are liberalizing for sure, but a noticeable gap is still there. And that right there brings us to probably the single most important takeaway from this entire study. Yes, the overall direction of change is pretty consistent, but, and this is a big but, the speed of that change is totally different depending on the group. So what's causing these different speeds? Well, the research points to two really big factors. First, and this is a huge one, is religious affiliation. Basically, who you pray to, or if you pray at all. And second is the specific issue you're talking about. It turns out these two things are way more important than just knowing what country someone came from. Yeah, get this. The study actually found that someone's religious identity was a better predictor of their social values than their country of origin. That's a pretty big deal. And as you can see here, not everyone is moving at the same pace. The data shows that, on average, Muslim immigrants tend to have a slower pace of liberalization from one generation to the next. On the flip side, Christian immigrants, and especially those who aren't religious, tend to close that value gap with Europeans a whole lot faster. And you know what? This pattern isn't just a one-off thing we see with gender roles. Let's pivot to another really sensitive topic: abortion. You're going to see the exact same dynamic play out.
There's that clearer generational shift towards more liberal views, but again, the speed of that change varies a ton depending on the group. Check this out. This slide lays it out so clearly. We're looking at the value gap on whether abortion can be justified. And look, it's the same story all over again. Second-generation Christian immigrants completely erase the gap. They go from -1.6 to 0. Bam! Their views become indistinguishable from rooted European Christians. Now, for non-Western Muslims, you do see a shift from a gap of -2.9 to -2.2. So there's definitely movement, but a pretty big gap is still there in the second generation.
Okay, this all brings us to the one issue where the study found the biggest, the most stubborn, and honestly the most significant value gap between groups. Yeah, the data here is just completely unambiguous. Out of all the issues they looked at, gender roles, divorce, abortion, you name it, attitudes towards homosexuality is where the values converge the slowest. It's not even close. And to really hammer this home, just look at this number, -3.0. That's the value gap on that same 10-point scale. What that means is the average view of a second-generation Muslim from a developing country is a full 3 points. That's 30% of the entire scale, more conservative than a rooted European Christian on this one specific issue. That is a massive difference. And here's what that number looks like when you put it on a chart. You can just see it, right? This isn't some tiny statistical blip. It's a huge, profound difference in how two groups see the world on this specific topic. And again, this is the single largest gap they found anywhere in the entire study. So let's break down the numbers one last time, because this is the key. For Christian immigrants, that gap on homosexuality gets cut by more than half in just one generation. It goes from -1.8 to -0.8. That's fast convergence. But for non-Western Muslim immigrants, the gap starts out bigger, at -3.6, and only shrinks to -3.0. The pace of change is just on a completely different level. And the researchers themselves are very blunt about what this could mean. They say, and this is a direct quote from their conclusion, that in the long run, these kinds of persistent value differences could actually make the cultural boundaries between groups more distinct, not less. That's a pretty heavy conclusion. All right, so we've seen this really complex picture of values changing and values staying the same. Let's step back and pull it all together. What is the big takeaway here about integration? Okay, so if we're going to boil this whole thing down, it really comes to three main takeaways. Number one, value integration is real. There's no doubt about it. The second generation is consistently more liberal than the first. Number two, that integration process is uneven. The speed is massively influenced by religious background. And number three, some value gaps are just way more stubborn than others, with attitudes towards homosexuality being the biggest and most lasting difference, especially among Muslim immigrants. And that really leaves us with the big, lingering question that the research itself raises. What does it mean for a society in the long run when groups come together on some values but stay really far apart on others? What this all shows is that integration isn't some simple, straight line. It's a complex, uneven process, and figuring out that dynamic is probably one of the most important challenges for diverse societies moving forward.